What are the core concepts of the book, The Great Reset? Hi everyone, my name is Johannes and welcome to this channel. Welcome to Mastering Consulting. On this channel, I share my own learnings and experiences from my own current journey in management consulting to help you to become more successful in consulting and living a balanced life. And if you're new to this channel, then please subscribe to it. Also leave a thumb up. This will help to grow the channel and will help you that you don't miss any new video. And today we have another book review. We will talk about the book summary of The Great Reset. And today this might be a longer session because this is a very extensive book, and I really liked it. It came out like 2 years ago when the COVID pandemic started, and I immediately read it, and there were so many great insights about the macro developments that the World Economic Forum sees, that I really wanted to summarize it. And I did a summary already a year ago, but I never published it. So today I want to talk a little bit more about that, and I really hope that you like it and it brings value. So let's talk a little bit, let's talk maybe with the summary of the book. So it was written in 2020. The authors are Klaus Schwab, so the founder of the World Economic Forum, and Thierry Malaret, and both of them, they very often write books together. And the background of both of them is that they work for the World Economic Forum. And the book has 3 chapters. It first talks about the so-called macro reset. And this basically, is a summary of the most macro environmental trends that they see. And the core question that they try to answer in the book is, what impact will have COVID-19 on all of those environmental factors? So they talk about overall trends in the macro environment that they see. They particularly talk about economic developments, developments in the society, developments in the geopolitical sector, also about the environment, how that will change. Then the next chapter is about the micro reset, as they call it, and this is like the industry perspective. So they talk about some industries that are winners and losers from COVID-19. They talk about overall micro trends that they see, and they also talk about certain industries where they see some key developments. Also, they talk about the individual reset. This is chapter number 3. So there they talk about the change of humanity as a whole. They also talk about mental health and well-being, and also about the changing priorities of people. So this is the structure, but I have to say that, especially chapter 1 is the most extensive one, and this is certainly where you get the most important information out, because I think the World Economic Forum always has a very good bird view on the macro environmental developments that you see. And in consulting, we very often have those 4 levels of analysis where we say, okay, we take a look at the macro trends, industry trends, at the company, and also at the organization, the 4th level. And I think, the World Economic Forum is always great to get a very good picture of the macro trends. Okay, so this is also why I am also, always very interested in what the World Economic Forum publishes. But I would say we go through each chapter in more detail. And what I want to do in this summary is that I really talk about the contents, the developments that they see. Maybe one caveat. So this book was written in 2020. So we are now 2 years further ahead. We already know much more, for example, how COVID-19 really turned out. So this is a bit outdated, but most macro trends are still valid to 100%. And that's why I want to give a little bit more background here. So they start with the overall macro trends, and they see mainly 3 macro trends. And what they say is that the entire world becomes much more interdependent. And what that means is that all the macro trends are much more linked together. They say that you cannot take a look at the economy itself, environment itself, technology itself, but that all of those categories, those major categories, are much more interconnected. So for example, if you have a health issue like COVID, this immediately impacts the economy. This also impacts the environment. This also, of course, pushes a huge technological development, and everything becomes more and more interconnected. Not only if we talk about those macro dimensions, but also if we talk about countries, because we're all sitting in the same boat. For example, if we talk about climate change, then you cannot say, okay, this country is affected, this other country is not affected. We are all affected by it. And also they see the same for businesses and politics, so that if we think about, large tech companies, the giants like Google or Facebook, that we cannot separate strictly anymore between government and companies, but they become more and more interconnected. Also, they see a increasing velocity, so this means like speed. So they say, okay, the speed of economic events or macro events becomes faster and faster, and I think we definitely also saw that in a couple of years. So we had like almost like civil war in America. We had COVID. We had the Ukraine war. We had like almost a crash. So there are many events that come very, very quickly, and the speed of development certainly increases. Also, we have an increase in complexity, mainly driven by those two factors we just described. And this is kind of, they are setting the scene. They say those are the three main factors that they see in the macro environment. Then they do the first deep dive and they talk about the economy. And what they say is that, especially due to COVID-19, the economy is facing a high uncertainty. So what we had back then was that we didn't know if we had a V shape, a U shape, or L shape in the economy. Now we know that it was a V shape before, because the Fed printed all of that money, and now it turns out to probably turn into a recession. They also say COVID had a huge impact on growth and employment. So they talk about growth, that we have a declining GDP, so gross domestic product. So this means economic growth. And they also doubt that after COVID, and maybe we now have to say after the recession, that we have this same growth rates again that we saw in the previous years. So they are even suggesting that maybe we enter a post-growth era where we cannot define economic development only by growth anymore, where we have to realize, okay, that also our developed economies cannot grow in the same pace that it grew in the past years. Also, employment is a huge topic. So we had a spike of unemployment in 2020, then we had a slight recovery in 2021. I think it's very interesting. The question will be very interesting how it will develop now, because if there is really a recession coming, this obviously will have a huge negative impact on employment rates, because obviously we have a lot of so-called zombie companies that only survive because of the money that the government or that the central banks printed. And if there is a recession and if those companies will not survive, then this will have a very negative impact on the employment. And as I just said, they make some future predictions. They say that the growth rates will be slower, and they also say that it will probably take some time until we get back to the same economic strength. Also, they talk about fiscal and monetary policies. Back then there was the question how inflation will turn out. Now we know it for sure. So central banks print a lot of money. We're now entering or already entered inflation, and this obviously leads to increasing interest rates, and this again leads to a downturn of the economy. This is what we are currently seeing. Very interesting is that they also talk about the fate of the USD as a reserve currency, and they say that the time of the US dollar as a reserve currency is kind of limited, but also that at the moment there is no valid alternative. And this is very similar to what Ray Dalio says in this book, where he talks about why nations fail, where he talks about the macro developments of the huge empires like the US and China, especially about their conflicts. He also says there or suggests that maybe the time of the dollar as a reserve currency is limited. Very interesting here. Then the book also talks about the society trends, okay? And they say, okay, we see increasing inequalities. And the thing is that due to COVID, where all the money was printed, it's always the same problem. It's always the same problem of a fair redistribution. And what you typically see is that those countries and those people who are already wealthy, they became more wealthy, especially, you know, some of the developed countries, they handled the crisis very well, while, some emerging countries, especially in Africa, they couldn't handle the crisis that well because the infrastructure wasn't there. And that means that the inequalities rise and rise and rise. And you see that, also if we talk about, maybe a developed country like Germany, because we see that, the groups that suffered the most during the crisis were certainly, like the low wage sector, like for example, gastronomy, so restaurants, then travel, stuff like that. All the artists scene, music scene, all of those people, they really had a hard time during those lockdowns. While, like for example, the well-paid service industry jobs, all of the the lawyers, the consultants, the investment bankers, and so on, so they had pretty secure jobs. And of course, that again, leads to a situation where inequality rises. And this leads inevitable to the second factor, social unrest. So those inequalities, they lead to, to kind of tensions within societies. We already saw that with the US Capitol. We also see now that we have increasing demonstrations, and this is really an issue. And also, if you follow Ray Dalio, he also talks about that a lot, that there might be some internal tensions coming up if inequality gaps become too large. In the book, they also say that we will likely see a return of big government. So this means that we previously, in the past decades, had very open markets. Some of you might argue that this led to a financial crisis in 2008. But nevertheless, we had a kind of very free markets. And they see chances very high that we turn into an era where government will have more control over economy, where there will be more regulation. This also, in my opinion, plays along with the post-growth era kind of states capitalism, as we maybe see it, in the more Eastern countries like China, for example. We will see how that will turn out. But definitely the argument here is that very liberal countries are not, or independent economies are not that well able to react to crises like COVID. I mean, it's not here. I'm not here, to judge those positions. I just want to summarize the opinions of the World Economic Forum. So they say that a return of big government is very likely. Also, they ask the question of the social contract. So they see that there is less trust in the institutions, and you see that with the high activity of the youth. So you see a lot of demonstrations, particularly if we talk about climate change. Then people lose trust. They see a increase in inequality, as we just said. They see ineffectiveness in the redistribution of money. Also a kind of sense of exclusion, this kind of elite circle, especially in the US. I think this is very obvious. That people are very critical about the elites that govern the country. And also there's a kind of feeling of unfairness. At least that's what the World Economic Forum sees here. Very interesting. And if we put that all together, I mean, this is challenging or even alarming. So definitely some trends and developments that point in a certain direction. If we take a look at the geopolitics space, then we see that there is an increasing globalization and nationalism. And the way the World Economic Forum sees it is that globalization made a huge contribution over the past decades on the economic growth. But they also say that globalization is now slowing down or even reversing. And we definitely see that during COVID. Okay, so globalization kind of slowed down or even reversed. and people and companies really try to shorten their supply chains. And what I really think is interesting is that they suggest that we enter an era of regionalization, and this means that we go away from very complex global supply chain back to a system where we have more regional hubs, like in Europe, in Asia, in the US, because those shorter supply chains are maybe a bit more expensive, but they are more resilient. And what we saw in the COVID era was that there were, many shortfalls in supply. This was a very, very difficult time for many companies. And in order to prevent those defaults, companies really focus, and I see that in the market as well, focus on shortening the supply chains. Then they also say that we need a global governance, because they say that the biggest problems that we are facing, like pandemics, like climate change, like international conflicts, can only be solved on a global level. And they see that we have no real international organization that is capable of doing that. And as an example, they cite, the US withdrawal from the WHO organization, so World Health Organization, and that some developments tend towards a even less global governance system than towards a development that kind of enables a global governance system. Then also they see a increasing rivalry between the US and China. I think this is very obvious. And they also see a new Cold War emerging, and maybe think that the system will split between a Western and an Eastern system. This is definitely something that they see. And they also see the danger of fragile and failing states. So especially in Africa, they see a huge potential for new conflicts, because many states are very fragile. Then if we take a look at the environmental trend, and don't forget, so this is with a focus on COVID, so there are many environmental trends that are not reflected in here, but what they see is that nature and zoonotic diseases will increase due to the destruction of biodiversity and the rainforest, for example. So they say, okay, the more we push into the living space of animals, and the more it will be likely that kind of zoonotic diseases spread around the world. Also, they see that the air pollution increases the risk for pandemics. And they say, in some cities, especially in Asia, the air is so bad that this really attacks the immune system of people and makes them even more endangered to be affected by those pandemics. Also, on the other hand, they see a very positive effect from COVID. So they say, okay, lockdowns and carbon emissions have a very positive impact on the CO2 emission reduction, because obviously, air travel was almost, completely broke down. And we also had decreasing traveling activities in general due to the lockdowns. And obviously, this had a huge positive impact on the CO2 emissions. And they see two options, how this will turn out after the pandemic. So they say, okay, and I am afraid that this is probably the scenario we are heading towards. They say option one is that governments are too busy with other issues, like, for example, economic decline, wars that we now see, maybe new pandemics, that climate action will, kind of be deprioritized. This might be option one. Option two might be that we keep the momentum that we have from COVID and from the lockdowns and from the reduced emissions there, and really take action to kind of push in that direction. I'm not sure. So what I see now is more like option one. Also, if we talk about if we talk to companies, then I also see a lot that companies are more concerned about recession and stuff like that than about environment. Then let's talk about macro trends in terms of technology. So what the World Economic Forum sees is that we had an accelerating digital transformation due to the pandemic, and we certainly saw that across all levels. So for example, if we talk about the consumer, habits change to e-everything, so e-learning, e-shopping, e-gaming. Even my parents, they started doing more stuff online, and I think this is a trend that we saw or see, across the entire population. Also, we talk about the regulator, and we see that there was some global relaxation of regulations, particularly in terms of mobile payments, drone delivery, and telemedicine, because governments were forced to act during COVID-19, and this, of course, in terms of digitization, was a kind of progress. If we talk about the firms, they also really were digitizing themselves. Like the restructuring of workplace, so we have work from home concepts. Everyone is used now to do video conferences instead of meeting in person. We had the entire workspace got digitized, people got better digital equipment, but also we see more digitization of tasks like RPA, so robotic process automation. Those are technologies certainly that automate tasks done by people, and this is certainly a trend that we see as well. Then contact tracing and surveillance. Obviously this was increasing during COVID with all the apps, but we will have to see how this turns out. There are many pros and cons against it. The pros are certainly that governments are more quickly to act, that societies are more quickly to act. But of course, a huge disadvantage is that you give much more data away from you. So without going into more detail, it's just the situation. And they also highlight, and this is what I found to be very interesting, the risk of dystopia. So they see, okay, due to all the technological development, of course there are huge advancements, but they also see a big danger, especially in terms of surveillance and stuff like that, but also many opportunities. So as always, this word has kind of two sides, and we will see how it turns out. Good. Then let's talk a little bit about the microenvironment, and let's talk about the overall trends. So again, if we talk about industries, we saw an increasing digitization. So particularly, the B2C sector, so business to customer sector, this is kind of clear because the consumer behavior changed. But what is very interesting, and this is something that I can also confirm, is that the B2B environment also was, heavily digitized during the diseases, the pandemic and the lockdowns. Because, also on a B2B level, you had to be able to communicate, to exchange ideas, to work together, and also those interfaces really were digitized. And also, we already talked about that, our resilient supply chains. So they say that we move from a fragile, complex, just-in-time supply chain, which is very cost efficient, and to a just-in-case supply chain, where we shorten the supply chain, where it becomes more expensive, but also much more resilient. Then if they talk about governance and governments and businesses, they think that there will be greater influence of the government through bailouts, for example, especially if we talk about a recession now, public procurement, and also some more labor market regulations. And particularly if we see some recession coming and increasing layoffs, then I definitely expect the government to step in. And also, this is very interesting, is that they see a increasing stakeholder capitalism and ESG. So this means that they move from a shareholder capitalism, where the owner of the company is in the focus, to a system where we have a stakeholder capitalism, where all the stakeholders like society, governments, the workforce, and people who are affected by the company get into the focus. And there is a completely new book about that, written by the World Economic Forum, that I maybe will introduce to you or summarize for you within the next weeks. Then, staying with the industries, they say, okay, there are some winners. So this was certainly tech, health and wellness. So I think, there's no doubt about it. We also saw that the past 2 years in the stock prices. So unfortunately for all the tech investors, we don't see that now anymore. But we also had some losers, and this definitely was entertainment, travel, hospitality during the COVID crisis. And we had some industries where the consumer heavily changed. So for example, manufacturing or the food industry, where the consumer behavior changed, like food delivery, for example, and this changed an entire industry. And the World Economic Forum sees like 4 main questions. The first one is, how will work environment change? Companies definitely need to find answers to that. They also need to ask themselves how they can become more sustainable, also how they become more agile and more decisive. And this is definitely a problem. I mean, we all talk about becoming agile as corporates and stuff like that, but if you really see how interconnected, how interdependent, how complex the environment becomes, I think it's really, really important for companies to really become agile. And agile, I think, is a bad word because it's such a buzzword, but they need to have systems in place to really get to decisions very, very quickly. Because, if we have the next lockdowns, if we have the next, restrictions, maybe, as I said, a recession, some local wars, something like that, then companies really, really need to act quickly. And then you have to have a agile setup. And also they need to think about how to accelerate the digitization. Good, then let's talk about the last topic. Let's talk about individual trends. And this is, in my personal view, this is a bit, fizzy-fuzzy because I don't know, you can talk, you could mention everything here, but for the sake of completeness, I will talk about that. So they think, they need to redefine humanity, so which means that, unfortunately, history shows that during pandemics, humanity gets more separated. So it divides societies rather than putting them together. They make the example, there was a study that, in pandemics, everyone is more focused on himself, and they really just separates kind of people, while I think in crisis like a war, this really brings people together. So unfortunately, this is like a trend tending towards more separation in society. They also say that we will face much more moral choices in the future. And I think, I totally agree, especially if we talk about pandemics, if we talk about wars, climate change. Those are very, very complex questions. And we already saw, like in the pandemic, how that can change or split and divide society. Even families. I have seen families which heavily argue because, one person is pro-vaccines, the other person is against vaccines, and this kind of created huge conflicts even within close families. And I think those moral choices definitely will increase, and I think this will be really challenging. Then also they say mental health and well-being has suffered a lot, and I can also confirm that because I work together with a coach for relationships, and this person also offers like therapy for couples and singles. And the coach told me that there was so much depression going on because especially single people, they had no choice to meet people really during the pandemic. So this definitely had a very negative impact. And they see also that, priorities might change. They say maybe we'll have a focus on creativity in the future because all of those problems that we are facing, they, create a need for more creativity. Also that the value of time will increase. Also maybe that, consumption will change, that we go back or, stay with a low consumption profile in the society. But maybe there's also the revenge behavior, as they say, so that people said, okay, now I couldn't travel like for the past 2 years. Now I travel, double as much as I used to do before. So we don't know. And also they say that, and this is also something that I can definitely confirm, that there's an increased appreciation for nature and well-being, because during the pandemic we couldn't do much more than go outside and enjoy nature, and this is certainly a positive thing. Good. So with that being said, what did I like, what did I not like? So before we talk about that, maybe so I hope this gave you a good picture, and I thought for me it was very interesting to read through it, because it's always good to have this kind of bird view, because in each of those trends can have an impact on your project. So for example, if we talk about shortening supply chains, if we talk about increasing digitization, if we talk about economic developments, societal developments, even the geopolitical conflict, I think those are just topics that you should be aware of if you work in consulting. And that's why I think it's very important to talk about that a little bit more in detail. So, but with that being said, what did I like, what did I not like about the book? What I really liked was that it provided a great overview about the current developments. So this was certainly very, very good. It was also written in a very structured way. So they have a very structured argumentation style where they state the statement, then they explain the statement, then they have examples, and maybe some excerpts from a interview. So I really, really like that. Very easy to read, very easy to follow, very structured, good to summarize. So I really like that. And you have to say that the World Economic Forum is one of the most important think tanks in the world, and it's definitely very important to know what they are thinking and what their perspective is. I mean, it's only one perspective, but it's important to know about it. Cons is that the World Economic Forum, I mean, for some people it's kind of a controversial platform, because they say it's a kind of elite circle where there is only a certain view of a certain circle of people. Yeah, this might be the case. I just try to see it as neutral as possible. I mean, it's an important think tank, and there is a lot of analysis going on, as a preparation for writing this book. So I don't want to judge about that. And one thing maybe that kind of was difficult for me was that there are no real practical implications. So you get a good overview over the situation, but after that you ask yourself, so, okay, and what do we do now? I mean, maybe that's the intention, but I would love to have some suggestions, or more concrete suggestions at least, on what we can do, what concrete action plans are. But I mean, obviously, this is something that we have to figure out ourselves. So now the final question is, how many stars do I give from 1 to 5? 1 means you don't have to read the book at all. 5 means this is a must read. And I would really give 5 stars out of 5 stars, because I think it's really important to know about those trends. It's really important to know about what the World Economic Forum thinks. I think it was a very interesting read. It's not a huge book. I mean, you can get through it like in 2 weeks or so, and I really enjoyed reading it. I really enjoyed summarizing it. I read it multiple times, also obviously because of the summary, but it's just so much content, and so interesting and so basic for your work as a consultant, that I highly recommend that you read it. Good. So it was a long session, over 30 minutes now, and I really hope you liked it. Maybe this video doesn't get the most views because it's too long, but nevertheless, I hope this brought value to you. If you have opinions about what we talked about, if you have questions, then just write them in the chat. Of course, I'm also interested if I should do more of those book summaries. I mean, this was a bit more extensive, but please let me know how you like the format. I really try to bring some, some very unique value here on this channel. Let me know if this works and if you liked it. And if you liked it, then please subscribe to this channel. Please hit the like button, and this will help the channel, and obviously will help you that you don't miss any new video here. And with that being said, I wish that you have a great day, a very successful day, and I hope to talk to you soon. Goodbye, Johannes.